Welcome to Disabilities, Diversity, and Inclusion, Part 1, Introduction to Ableism. Before we begin, I'd like to address two content notes. First, this program contains references to ableism and some offensive language. This information is included for the purposes of educating others on the harm caused by ableism. Second, this presentation uses both person-first and identity-first language interchangeably, since either may be used depending on individual preference. When interacting with people with disabilities, it's important to consider their preferences first. One of the biggest challenges facing people with disabilities in America is ableism. Like racism, sexism, ageism, and other prejudices, ableism results in the systemic oppression of a group of people within our society. This program is designed to help parents, caregivers, providers, and people with disabilities to build a working understanding of ableism. After completing the program, you will not only be able to recognize ableism, you will also be able to apply what you have learned to dismantle it. To guide us on this journey, we'll be using 4 questions. They are: what is ableism? Why does it matter? What does ableism look like? What can we do about it? This program is divided into 4 parts to make it easier for you to learn at your own pace. This presentation covers the first question, what is ableism, by offering you some definitions, a framework for how ableism appears in our thoughts and in our actions, and some history and models that are commonly used to explain ableist behavior. Parts 2, 3, and 4 will share more about how ableism hurts different people and groups, give examples of what ableism looks like, and share some tools to help you dismantle ableism. Let's get started. There are many definitions for ableism. In fact, Michelle Nario-Redmond's 2020 book, Ableism: The Causes and Consequences of Disability Prejudice, shares at least 5 different alternatives. From all the alternative out there, I've chosen these 2. The first definition reads, ableism is the belief that atypicalities are inherently inferior. This comes from Ryan McElprang's chapter in Doman Lum's Culturally Competent Practice, a book designed to build skills for social workers who work with diverse populations. The second definition comes from Michelle Nario-Redmond. It describes ableism as prejudice and discrimination toward individuals simply because they are classified as disabled, regardless of whether their impairments are physical or mental, visible or invisible. Great, but why do we need 2 definitions? Isn't it enough to know that ableism is a form of prejudice? Sure, but knowing what something is not nearly as powerful as knowing how it came to be. When Michelle Nario-Redmond offered her definition of ableism in her book, she also shared her ABCs of ableism. These are A, as an affective. The affective component of ableism is related to our emotions and our attitudinal reactions. B, for behavioral. These are the ableist actions and practices we commit. C, for cognitive. These are the beliefs and stereotypes that drive our affective reactions and behaviors. If you look at the 2 definitions from the previous slide, you'll see that neither one covers all 3 components of ableism. Nario-Redmond's definition covers prejudice, which is an attitudinal reaction, and discrimination, which is a behavior. McElprang, on the other hand, touches on the belief. Together, the 2 definitions give us a bigger picture of what ableism is. But there's more to it than that. Beliefs, reactions, and behaviors don't just appear from nowhere. We know this because babies aren't born with beliefs. They learn them as they grow. There has to be something there that pushes us as a society to construct them. That's where a concept called structural status comes in. In culturally competent practice, Doman Lum organizes the ABCs into a chronological order and places a step ahead of them, namely structural status. So what is that? Structural status represents the power and privilege held by different individuals or groups. And here's the thing with power and privilege. Once we have it, tell ourselves a lot of things to justify keeping it. Over time, the things we tell ourselves to justify keeping power and privilege, say atypicalities are inherently inferior, become a core part of our beliefs. These beliefs are imprinted on us, and we end up being programmed with a specific internal response. That's prejudice. When we have an internal prejudice, we are more likely to have an external response that includes discrimination, oppression, marginalization, and sometimes even violence toward a person or groups we are prejudiced against. Not entirely convinced? Let's take a quick stroll through disability history. I've chosen to stick to American history for this presentation because it neatly fits into a little over 500 years. But if you look at world history, you'll see the same patterns spread out over a longer time span. I also want to make the important distinction here that the timeline presented primarily reflects the experience of cisgender European Americans. Inequities faced by minority populations, including Black Americans, immigrants, and LGBTQ populations, compound the struggles associated with disability in ways that are often devastating to the individual, his or her family, and the community. Starting from colonization into pre-industrialization, Americans of European descent were primarily subsistence farmers. They grew enough food for the family and maybe some goods to trade with skilled craftspeople. The thing about a family farm is that there's always some job to be done, and more hands are always better, even if those hands don't have the same abilities. As a result, people with disabilities generally stayed with their families and performed jobs around the farm that were adapted to their skills. For enslaved Black Americans, disability was devastating. Depending on how much a disability prevented these individuals from working, it could mean anything from being assigned the most dangerous or menial tasks to abuse and euthanasia. According to historian Jim Downs, emancipation offered little relief to enslaved people with disabilities because true freedom was based on the ability to work. Those who were free to work were able to flee the South, but for people with disabilities, leaving the plantations where they had been enslaved was difficult, if not impossible. The farm life many American families relied upon began to change with industrialization. Factory work enticed families who were just getting by on farms to move to cities where they could get wage jobs. Except once these families moved to the cities, they began to see that getting work was highly competitive and that the wages didn't afford them any more comfort than they had before. Worse, families who brought disabled dependents found themselves unable to care for their family members due to the long workdays. Poor pay and loss of community added to the burden, leaving many families with the heart-wrenching decision of whether to institutionalize their disabled loved ones. In the early 1900s, another tragedy struck for people with disabilities. Buck versus Bell, a 1927 court case, sought to sterilize a woman named Carrie Buck on the grounds that her alleged intellectual disability made her a genetic threat to society. The case was based on the misconception that Carrie Buck had genetically inherited her mother's feeble-mindedness after becoming pregnant with an illegitimate child. Not only was Carrie Buck ultimately sterilized as a result of this case, Buck versus Bell set up a precedent that disability was genetically transmitted and that it could be removed from the population through forced mass sterilization. Once Buck versus Bell was decided, states went on to pass their own forced sterilization laws, some of which remained on the books well into the 2000s. In fact, West Virginia was the last state to repeal their forced sterilization law in 2012. For its part, Buck versus Bell remains on the books at the federal level today. It's also important to note that Black Americans have been disproportionately impacted by sterilization laws. There's a great podcast listed in the references for this presentation if you want to learn more. It was produced by Radiolab and it's called Unfit. World War I made things better for some people with disabilities, namely disabled veterans who were returning from battle. During this time, policies were put in place to help disabled veterans reintegrate with their lives, including the Soldiers' Rehabilitation Act, which supported vocational rehabilitation for disabled veterans. In 1935, Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed the Social Security Act into law. For the first time, the federal government would allocate funding specifically to support people who were aged or who had disabilities that prevented them from continued employment. What was interesting about this was that Social Security was only available to people who had worked in commerce or industry jobs. Farming and domestic workers, fields which included many Black Americans and women, remained ineligible for Social Security. It's also worth noting that while this law was intended to provide a safety net for people with disabilities, below poverty level income limits on this benefit have caused great hardship. One common example cited by disabled adults is inability to marry because the newly combined family income will result in loss of benefits. During World War II, America faced a shortage of workers resulting from soldiers going to war. Increased participation in the labor force for people with disabilities was not only an option, it was necessary. Several acts and policies were put in place at both the state and national level, including the Barton-Lafayette Act of 1934, that extended federal and state rehabilitation programs to people with intellectual disabilities and the blind. As the war ended, attitudes towards people with disabilities began to shift once again. Soldiers returned to the jobs they had left behind, and the vocational rehabilitation movement began to refocus on sheltered workshops. Suddenly, people with disabilities found themselves in a secondary job market that offered a different quality of employment and wages. The civil rights movement offered a different kind of opportunity for people with disabilities. Many joined in supporting equal rights and were able to learn strategies from the movement's success that would eventually help them build a movement of their own. During the latter part of the 20th century, advocacy efforts finally began to pay off in the form of legislation that guaranteed rights to a free and appropriate public education and protections from discrimination. The Education for All Handicapped Children Act, later IDEA, mandated inclusion of students with disabilities in public schools. This law also set up programming for infants and toddlers through Part C, which establishes funding for early intervention programs. The ADA, signed in 1990, guaranteed protections for discrimination for people with disabilities. Like IDEA, the ADA is broken into separate parts or titles that protect employment, public services, accommodations, and telecommunications. Despite this legislation and others aimed at equal rights for people with disabilities, injustices are still common. Many people with disabilities are underemployed, meaning that they work at jobs that are below their skill level or capability. Disabled adults also struggle to find affordable housing that is accessible and health insurance that meets their needs. And while disabled voters have been more empowered to participate, many issues impact their ability to vote, resulting in suppression of these voices. Access to employment, housing, healthcare, and voting rights are further compounded when a disabled person is part of another minority population, including women, racial minorities, immigrants, religious minorities, and LGBTQ populations. We can qualify some of the claims with familiar statistics. First, we know that people with disabilities are the largest minority population in the United States. According to the CDC, about 1 in 4 Americans has a disability. While people with disabilities tend to be more present in the older part of our population, children with disabilities consistently grow as a demographic. Today, approximately 14% of public school students qualify for special education services due to a disability. Despite making up more than 1/4 of the American population, people with disabilities continue to have a low employment numbers. In 2018, a non-disabled adult could count on about 65% chance of being employed. But when a disability is factored in, that percentage drops to under 20. Housing is another area where people with disabilities struggle. According to the Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, more than half of all fair housing claims are the result of disability discrimination. It's clear from our history and our look at modern statistics that discrimination against people with disabilities is systemic and part of modern American culture. But how did we get here? And more importantly, where are we headed? Once upon a time, it was only sociologists who used models to explain human behavior. But these models offer a really accessible way for everyday people to understand things too. When people talk about disabilities, They are generally referencing one of three main models: the moral model, the medical model, or the social model. Before we get into a discussion of the models, it's important to note that none are inherently good or bad. In fact, each model has strengths and weaknesses. What we need to keep in mind as we explore them is that the models are here to help us understand why people behave in different ways. When we understand why something happens, we're in a better position to make change. We'll start with the moral model because it's the oldest. From a very high level, the moral model asserts that ability is the result of divine intervention. It also tells us that disability can be a gift or a curse. People who operate under the moral model may think or believe things like, disabled people are put here to teach us humility, or my son was given to me to make me a better person. These frames cast disability as a gift from the divine, but just as often, we see disability cast as a curse. Examples of this include beliefs that disability is a punishment for the sins of the parents or for behavior in a past life. This mindset is also represented when people with disabilities are excluded from the community because of a belief that they are inherently deviant or dangerous. While this model has obvious negative component in the disability as a curse line of thinking, the moral model is extremely helpful in fostering resilience. Humans draw great strength from our spiritual connections, and allowing ourselves to frame disability as a gift can empower both people with disabilities and their loved ones. The moral model is culturally significant in communities that are more closely associated with religion, such as Black and Latino cultures. Work in inclusion ministries, especially in the Black church, has great potential for engaging people with disabilities in the greater spiritual community and laying groundwork for cooperative, mutually beneficial relationships based on individual talents. The appearance of the medical model coincides with advances in modern medicine. Today, we can diagnose and treat thousands of diseases and conditions. We've sequenced DNA to the point where we can tell whether a child may have a condition before ever being born. And we've developed technology that makes everyday tasks easier for millions of people with disabilities. It's truly an exciting time to be alive. But with the ability to treat a condition comes the important ethical question: should we treat? People who follow the medical model tend to see the answer to that question with a resounding yes. The implication of this response is that to be disabled is to need fixing. The other problem with the medical model is that it places the emphasis on the individual. This can keep us from seeing the social and environmental conditions that make one situation more disabling than another. For example, you could say that a disabled child is unable to play on the playground because the child uses a wheelchair. This frame emphasizes the individual disability and how it keeps the child from doing something he or she wants. But it also keeps us from seeing the larger context, namely that playgrounds with mulch surfaces aren't wheelchair friendly. Just by changing the surface or the environment, the child could enjoy the playground and the disability would be a non-issue. Just like the model before it, we can see that this model has both strengths and weaknesses. The option to use medicine and technology has improved the lives of many people with disabilities, but it has also made it easier for people to forget that our culture and environment can be bigger obstacles than the disability itself. The social model of disability is perhaps the newest model on the scene, and the one most preferred by people with disabilities. Under this model, disability is seen as a social construct. Essentially, a social construct is an idea or belief that people accept and agree upon. A very simple example is the use of calendars to mark the passage of time. In Western culture, we use a Julian calendar with 12 months that have been between 28 and 31 days. In Asian cultures, the preference is for a lunar calendar that uses moon cycles to mark the passage of time. Both the Julian calendar and the lunar calendar work for the societies that have adopted them and have cultural significance. The social model puts disability in the same frame as the calendar example. As a society, we simply agree that some people are disabled and some people are not. Those placed in the minority disabled group have less access to resources because there are fewer of them. The cartoon in this slide gives a great example of how that works. In the cartoon, an adult is shoveling the steps to a school building as students wait. A boy who uses a wheelchair asks if a ramp can be cleared, and the adult responds that a lot of students are waiting to get in. He wants to shovel the stairs and take care of the larger group first. The boy then points out that if the man just shoveled the ramp, everyone could get in. The benefit of using this model is that it challenges us to think about how we can make our world more inclusive. It forces us to ask why. Of course, asking why can mean that we change the status quo. That can be met with resistance. When the adult in the cartoon shovels the ramp and gives everyone access, the students who would have used the steps may have to wait for the student who uses the wheelchair to maneuver. They could be late to class, or they may not like waiting. Sharing resources can be challenging, even for the most good-natured person. In part 2 of this program, we'll take a look at how disability impacts all of us by developing an understanding that disability doesn't just impact the disabled person. We can be better positioned to ask why and shift the status quo toward a more inclusive community. This concludes the first part of this program. In part 2, we'll begin to look at the different ways people are impacted by disability prejudice. Parts 3 and 4 will give examples of what ableism looks like and share some tools to help you dismantle ableism. Before we go, I'd like to thank some of the talented individuals who have helped make this program a reality. Thank you to Charisse Montgomery for your valuable insights into experiences of Black Americans with disabilities. Sarah Rintamaki has helped to support this project from the beginning with overwhelming encouragement and with her insights into the experiences of families with a disabled minor child. Finally, Lisa Ruman contributed to this project through an extension of her supervision work and by helping me include systems and empowerment approaches consistent with social work values. I am deeply grateful to each of you for your support.